Psilocybin mushrooms are magical fungi that grow all around the world, even before Jesus was riding dinosaurs. Unlike most psychedelics, the psilocybin mushroom is a complete entheogen, meaning that you don't need to mix, match, cook, or extract it to receive its full effects. It just grows from the ground, ready to go, mate. Some evidence would suggest that the use of psilocybin mushrooms date back to 9,000 years ago, based on the art at the Tassili caves in Africa. The most common use for psilocybin mushrooms in ancient cultures was for spiritual healing and to communicate with the gods. However, not everybody was using mushrooms for benevolent purposes. Some written observations account the malevolent use of the mushroom among the Montezumanic people. Allegedly, during the emperor's coronation ceremony, many prisoners were sacrificed, had their flesh eaten and their hearts removed. Those who were invited guests to the feast ate mushrooms, which Diego Duran describes as causing those who ate them to go insane and many to take their lives. After the Spanish conquest, Catholic missionaries deemed all hallucinogenic plants and fungi as demonic tools, basically, which eventually diminished the religious use of magic mushrooms, at least in mainstream culture. But despite this, mushrooms were still used in some remote areas. Psilocybin mushrooms were later rediscovered in the West in the late 1950s by mycologist Gordon Wasson. He participated in a mushroom ceremony with Maria Sabina, a Mexican shaman who first introduced magic mushrooms, also known as the children, to the modern world. So basically, if it wasn't for her, we probably wouldn't know about shrooms today. So Wasson then collected the spores of the mushroom, took them to Paris, which was later cultivated in Europe, and its primary ingredient, psilocybin, was isolated in the laboratory by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1958, and the rest is history. Now, many people leave out that later in life, Maria Sabina actually regretted introducing mushrooms to Wasson and ended up being ostracized from her community. She became bitter about her many misfortunes and how others had profited from her name. She felt that the ceremony of magic mushrooms had been irredeemably polluted by the hedonistic use of mushrooms. From the moment the foreigners arrived, the holy children lost their purity, they lost their force, they ruined them. Henceforth, they will no longer work. There is no remedy for it. Before Wasson, nobody took the children simply to find God. They were always taken to cure the sick. In 1957, Wasson wrote the famous Life magazine article Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which ended up inspiring psychedelic advocate Timothy Leary, who funded the Harvard Psilocybin Project with Richard Albert, now known as Ram Dass, promoting the psychological and religious study of psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs. For those who don't know, Leary was one of the most infamous leaders of the hippie counterculture movement, which the government revolted against with the war on drugs and eventually banned any further research on psychedelic drugs, making them highly illegal substances.
There is nothing smart, there is nothing grown up or sophisticated in taking an LSD trip at all. They're just being complete fools. Anyone that would engage in this or indulge in this is just a plain fool.
Psilocybin and psilocin are now listed as Schedule I drugs under the United Nations 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances. Schedule I drugs are defined as substances with a high potential for abuse or have no recognized medical uses. After a 40-year hiatus on psychedelic research, there has since been a psychedelic renaissance in the scientific community and mainstream culture.
Something's going on. The culture is ready to have this conversation. I really think we're in an inflection point right now, and I didn't see it coming.
Nowadays, psychedelics such as psilocybin mushrooms have been recognized by the medical community as a legitimate medicine that can have profound effects when used in the right context, particularly for treating mental illness. And this can sound absolutely insane when you first hear this. It's like, yeah, alright mate, I'm sure taking drugs is going to help me with my mental health. Bloody hippies. But if you take a closer look at the research, you'll quickly discover that there's actually something to this. It's not just idiots like me making silly claims. There are actual legitimate scientists from respected institutions such as the Johns Hopkins University, MAPS, and Imperial College London that have conducted studies suggesting that psychedelics such as psilocybin, ayahuasca, and ibogaine can significantly help with mental illness, drug addiction, and even existential dread, among others. And the results are looking very promising. Unlike other classes of drugs such as alcohol, caffeine, heroin, or crystal meth, psilocybin mushrooms work very differently. For example, when you consume alcohol or nicotine, you know exactly what you're in for, since these drugs have a very specific mechanism. But psychedelics like psilocybin have a non-specific amplifying effect on human consciousness, which results in vastly different experiences from person to person. Sometimes life-transformative mystical experiences, and other times a complete psychotic breakdown. But as Joseph Campbell once said, the psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight. And this is exactly why set and setting is so crucial for these type of experiences, and why these tools are not for everybody.
Jung told people, he talked about mescaline and LSD in the context of Huxley's introduction of those substances into the Western world. The first thing he said is, beware of unearned wisdom. It's like, yeah, man, that's great. And he also said, you have to be very careful about entering the realm of the gods, because you end up with a responsibility that might be more crushing than you can tolerate. I've never read anyone who wrote wiser words about the dangers of psychedelic use than that, because he didn't say, well, none of this is real. He said, it's more real than you want it to be, and so watch the hell out.
When ingested, psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, quickly metabolizes into psilocin, which acts as a 5-HT2A, 2C, and 1A agonist. Now, in English, this means that psilocybin attaches to our serotonin receptors, similar to a key fitting a lock. Serotonin, which is primarily found in the body's stomach and intestines, is the chemical responsible for regulating mood, visuals, decision-making, sleep, and digestion. Physically speaking, psilocybin mushrooms are virtually non-toxic and anti-addictive. In other words, it's almost impossible to physically die from consuming mushrooms and to develop a physical dependence. I mean, it's not very often you hear of a shroom addict. Gotta see those fractals, man! However, psychologically, this is another story. But at the end of the day, this really comes down to the individual's mental state and the environment one trips in. The mushroom experience is notorious for giving you access to the unconscious, which of course results in different experiences since everyone has a unique mind. Maybe this is why quote-unquote bad trips can be so terrifying, because they can show you repressed aspects of your psyche, which can be quite uncomfortable, especially if you've been running away from your shadow your whole life. And this is why building the foundation of your mind is of utmost importance. Similar to most psychedelics, mushrooms are a perfect example of extreme polarity within the human experience, especially at high doses. In fact, many times a mushroom trip can either take you to heaven or hell, sometimes both within the same trip. However, I do want to distinguish a bad trip from a challenging trip. A challenging trip, which may be perceived as horrific at the time, can actually produce long-term benefits when integrated, whereas a bad trip can cause severe psychological damage, which may not be super common, but it definitely does happen, which needs to be acknowledged. We can't always pull a Leary and blindly worship the mushroom gods. We must stay critical and see things as they are. I mean, let's not forget that it's this sort of reckless behavior that fueled the prohibition of psychedelics in the first place. In the best case scenarios, psilocybin has helped people with clinical depression, cluster headaches, bipolar syndrome, OCD, nicotine addiction, and even existential despair, which in some cases results in literally saving lives. Now, in the worst case scenarios, mushrooms can do quite the opposite and actually trigger PTSD, depression, and existential despair. Some people have developed full-blown psychosis, which they never recovered from, and others have even taken their own life. Psychedelics are no joke, and remember that we are just at the infancy stage of psychedelic research. There is still a lot that we don't know, but what we can say is that psychedelics are incomprehensibly strange and ineffable.